You're at 109 right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, all right, I'm back in the saddle. This is the IC 109 podcast. I'm Larry Wiggs, your host through this audio experience. I took some notes and I left the notepad. I took some notes down, I jotted them down, and I left the notepad on the seat that is directly across from me. I need to stand up and walk and get them. Give me 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. I'll be right back. And I'm back. Tonight's episode will be about capitalism, or at least this segment. I wanted to start the discussion off with the topic of capitalism. Now, I looked up capitalism, and the definition I found said something to the effect: capitalism is an economic system characterized by private ownership. And there was more to this definition, but that's pretty much what I remember and pretty much where I want to focus. So capitalism is an economic system characterized by private ownership. Now, if we compare and contrast capitalism and communism or socialism, and by communism and socialism, I'm going to use them interchangeably. Perhaps there's a difference, but strictly speaking, for me, they're pretty much the same thing. Now, because I'm not a Marxist. Karl Marx, if you study Karl Marx's works, then you know what? I just said Marxist, and perhaps that's something different. You could be a Marxist, you could be a communist, you could be a socialist. To me, all of those are the same thing. Anywho, what's the difference between capitalism and socialism? Well, just as I said, capitalism is the economic system characterized by private ownership. Socialism is the economic system that is characterized by lack of private ownership. So what does that look like? Well, if you have a farm in a capitalist society, you sow and you reap a harvest. And you take your harvest, your crops, you take them to market, you sell them, and you directly benefit from the sale of your products. That's capitalism. And you're profit driven, right? The motive, the ideal for your activity. What is my motivation here? What is the motivation? It's to make a profit, to make more money in 1 year than you did the previous year, so that your life is better because you don't have to work so hard, or so that you grow. And there's so many other reasons, but basically it's profiting from your activity in a capitalist society. Now, the opposite of that is the socialist, communist, Marxist society, which says that anyone who is if you are a farmer, you're not going to benefit from your crops, from the sowing and reaping and harvesting of your crops. You're not going to individually, solely benefit, but your society will benefit because you're going to share or give what you harvest, your crops, your goods, over to the government, over to the state. because the state is the ownership body, not an individual, not a person. And so within a communist, socialist, Marxist society, the people collectively are benefiting from the hard work of individuals. Whereas in a capitalist society, the hard work of individuals is paid off when the individual earns a profit from their work. All right, so that's my understanding of the difference between capitalism and socialism, communism, Marxism, etc. That's my understanding. Private ownership and lack thereof. Two different systems, okay? Well, in America and Cuba, Cuba's a country I've traveled to. I've seen Cuba, you know, firsthand. I've had firsthand experiences in Cuba. But I've also, today I watched some documentaries. I watched one PBS documentary about a Cuban revolutionary who happened to be a white American from Toledo, Ohio, which was fascinating. But I was wondering where the music went. The talk band. I was wondering where that went. Okay. You're listening to the sounds of DJ Quick in the background. But anyway, where was I? Yeah, Cuba. I've been to Cuba, so today I watched these documentaries. The PBS documentary about William Alexander Morgan, a white American who participated in the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban Revolutionary War, alongside Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, Victor Dreke, Raul Castro, and some other folk I can't name. I don't even know, or they don't come to mind. Anywho, that's fascinating. He captured my curiosity, my interest. I said, wow, there was a white boy who was a part of the Cuban Revolution. I only hear about Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and Fidel Castro, Raul Castro. That's it. There was a whole host of others who were a part, and not only that guy, William Alexander Morgan, the white guy from Ohio, he wasn't the only member of the Cuban Revolution, Cuban Revolutionary War. There were others. There were many white men and maybe women, I don't know, who were members of the Cuban Revolutionary War that you don't hear about, which is a fascinating reality about that really focuses, well, it's really about the personalities and it's about the media and the stories that the media can create. But, that's probably another discussion, when we're focusing on the media, Have you ever seen those? Have you ever seen, where was I? I was at the Japanese American Museum in Little Tokyo. And at this one museum, there was an exhibit that focused on propaganda. It focused on the narrative, the shifting of a narrative, and how an image, a picture, can misrepresent the truth. So what they had is they had a picture of an event, and they framed it. They framed this event, or they framed the activity such that they would be able to tell a particular story or create a narrative, and that picture, as it was framed, would support or would tell that particular narrative. However, if you were to zoom out and you were to look at the the full picture, then you would be able to see that the narrative, the story that they're trying to run with isn't the whole truth. However, if you look at that frame that they are giving you, and you compare that to the story that they're presenting, then you would say, "Oh yes, that is the truth. That they are correct. That is what I see as well." But when you zoom out and you look at the whole picture, you're like, "That's not it. That's not the truth at all." And so when when you look at the Cuban Revolution, it's the same thing. You only see when you hear of Cuban Revolution. In my case, who I've learned about, has always been Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, primarily. Camilo Cienfuegos was this third person, this third character, you know, involved in the revolution that is seldom, spoken about. Probably because he died earlier, but also, well, who knows? I can't tell you, why he isn't, talked about more frequently. Anywho, that's something to think about. So when I learned about the white boy who was involved in the Cuban Revolutionary War, I was like, wow, I've never heard his story. I've never heard their stories, those white Americans who were participating in the Cuban Revolutionary War. Never heard those stories. And that's probably because their stories, his story, isn't one that should really be, or rather, that the media and the powers that be, it isn't a story that they want to actually promote, not to Americans. You want to keep Americans in place in their positions yeah. If you want Americans to stay in place, you don't tell them, hey, you can go somewhere else and have a better life or better experience. What you're getting in America isn't the best for you. You can find better and greater, abroad, in other situations, other circumstances. That's not the narrative. The narrative is America is the greatest country in the world. You better stick to whatever you're doing, and just be grateful that you have what you have. So anyway, it was quite interesting. It was just quite a surprise to learn about a white American man involved in the Cuban Revolutionary War. But if you remember that white boy who joined the Taliban, remember him? Was his name Lindsay or something? I don't remember his name. And I'm just riffing right now. This is just me speaking extemporaneously, and I'm also I will take some notes so I don't forget or I don't lose my train of thought. But for the most part, this is all from memory. Lynn, I think his name was Lynn. It was somebody like Lindsay, Lynn. The guy joined the Taliban. Whatever his ideals were, whatever he thought, whatever he knew, like that's not the cool idea for America. So of course he would be demonized, right? What is this crazy American goes and joins the Taliban? What was he thinking? Crazy man, In the media, demonized, right? So back to this discussion about economics, Cuba and America. What did I want to say? Oh, yeah. Let's talk about the Cuban Revolution, and I want to say that families families are behind all of this. Capitalism and socialism. There are families. You see, when we're talking about the presidential race, we're talking about Democrats and Republicans, but we're really talking about families. Republican families, Democratic, families. We're talking about the Trumps. We're talking about the Clinton. Well, not anymore, but Trump, Clinton, Bush, um, Obama's now. These are families, and and the reason why we have to talk about these families is because everything boils down to families. Think of your favorite brand, clothing brand. I'll give you one name, Ralph Lauren Polo, right? Ralph Lauren is a man's name. And so when you buy his clothes, you're supporting that man, that lifestyle. You're supporting his family, whomever is in his family, whomever he is taking care of. I don't know if he's married, I don't know if he has kids, I don't know, but whomever, you know, is in his family, that's who you're supporting by buying that stuff. Everything is about a family. There are families everywhere. When I buy Fiji water, I'm supporting the Resnicks. The Resnick family. Billionaires. Anywho, this is all related because the Resnicks are capitalists. Ralph Lauren is a capitalist. All right, but what I'm saying, the point that I want to make is that we don't always look at the people, the families that are behind these products. We look at the products and we buy them based upon some desire or some need that the product is going to, serve or fill. But when I was in school, I was told, never consume anything, never wear anything, never put something on your body, that you don't fully understand. Now, by that, this was Mr. Alan Kaplan who told us this. He gave us the example of wearing a cowboy's a bolo tie, that you often see cowboys or maybe even Native Americans wearing. And by Native Americans, I'm not sure who I'm referring to with that one. I think I should specifically call them by the names that I've come to know. If they're like the Osage Indians, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the I don't know, Choctaw, Algonquin, these people. The bolo tie, right? Not a tie that you would see on a businessman necessarily, but a cowboy, a bolo tie. So I think Kaplan gave an example of a bolo tie, some cowboy boots. There are these things that someone might put on and say, hey, that's the style. I like that style. I'm going to wear that and dress up. But those items, those garments had a particular purpose or a particular meaning within a culture. And for someone outside of that culture to wear those things, I guess I'm talking about cultural appropriation here. It's like you're not honoring the culture by wearing it because you're not a member of that culture. So that was the lesson from Mr. Alan Kaplan, my high school U.S. history, psychology, U.S. history and psychology teacher. And that's an ideal that I've held near and dear to me because I try to be careful what I put on my body. But in the case of Nike sneakers, I'm sorry. I've heard Angela Davis, I've heard Angela Davis speak on Nike and talk about how Nike exploits their workers and has folks in sweatshops creating these sneakers. She made her point. She's right. I shouldn't be buying Nike sneakers because they support sweatshops. I'm supporting sweatshops by giving my dollars to Nikes, but I need comfortable shoes that I can trust are quality made. And I guess I know Angela Davis is right, or she was right when she was right. She was correct when she made that statement. So I guess I just have to work harder and find some, I don't know, sustainable, economically um, compassionate, companies that aren't exploiting workers, in other countries and less developed nations and stuff like that. All right, but anyway, even Nike, is another corporation that's supporting. What's the? Is it Phil Knight who owns Nike, the CEO of Nike? What was uh what was the name? Oh right, the name of the Chicago Bulls coach. That was Phil Jackson. Okay. Yeah, so I think it was Phil Knight. I think the name of the Nike CEO is Phil Knight. Phil Jackson, the coach of the Chicago Bulls when Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, B.J. Armstrong, Horace Grant. Yeah, I remember growing up watching those games. Anywho, capitalism and communism, socialism, and all that. And then the white boy who was in the Cuban Revolutionary War. That was an interesting thing to learn. But these families, right? So basically, here's what I want to say about the Cuban Revolution, Cuban Revolutionary War, right? Led by Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and so on. Like you had the families of the mobs, the mob gang, the mobsters, the Italian mob, right? And basically, they had an interest in what was happening in Cuba because the mob was there in Cuba to, um, exploit the Cuban population, exploit them. They created their casinos. There was gambling. There was prostitution. There were shows. There was alcohol. There was just it, it was the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean, and that's where the mobsters were raking in the dough. And then you had the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency in America, that is basically running the world, keeping tabs on everything that's happening around the world and making sure that American companies and their interests are looked after. And so, and by the CIA, those are a group of families, a group of, men and women who work for the interest of the American government, of the no, of the American economy, right? That's the key here. It's the economy, stupid. It's the economy. And so there are those families. Then you have the mob, and they have those families. And then the Cubans, the Cuban families. The Cuban families are the ones who are mixed up in all of this. You've got these tough guy mobsters exploiting the Cuban economy, siphoning off money from the gamblers, whomever they may be. And the Cubans are suffering. The conditions of the Cuban populace is downgraded, degraded. And then that's the reason why Fidel Castro, came into power, because he was like, hey, life for the average Cuban is decimated, is devastated. And the governing body, Fulgencio Batista, isn't doing anything about it. So we need a revolution. We need a change we need to usher in change so that the people can live better. So that was Fidel Castro's whole thing. He's coming in with these new ideals to say, man, we're going to shake this place up and do better for the people. So, but you have all these families that are vying for position. They're jockeying for profiteering. They're trying to profit from the situation in Cuba. The Cuban people are the lowest on the totem pole. They're suffering the most. That's why the revolutionaries can come in and do what they do. But you got the mobsters, and then you got the Americans who want to control everything. All right. So that's basically my summation. All of these families, right? So then the question is, who wins? Who wins, right? Well, I guess it's the biggest army that wins. Mob, yeah, they've got a little bit. They've got a little bit of power. The Cuban people are really like sheep, because it's their military that should protect them. But when the military is supported by the US government, well, then you've got the US government dictating what the military is going to do to help the people. So basically when I watched the video today, I realized something, or at least I came to the conclusion that it was the United States the United States that initiated, managed, and carried out the Cuban Revolution. You see, maybe it was the US trying to get rid of the mob, trying to push the mob out. But there was a point in the documentary where the gentleman said that arms from America were, I guess, they were seized. Well, not seized. They were maybe seized. They weren't apprehended. They were confiscated. I don't know, or maybe they were just stolen. The mob. The story is that the mob got control of U.S. arms and sent them to Cuba. Wait, I got that wrong. No. Okay, so that white boy from Toledo, Ohio, well, he was hired to take arms that the mob had collected, and his job was to bring those take those the weapons. He was an arms dealer, so he was going to go to Cuba. All right, let me back up. So this white boy is in America, and he's out of luck. He was dismissed. He was dishonorably discharged from the military. He was a hothead and just had a whole bunch of problems. And he's a young guy too. And he had no other options, but this opportunity presented itself whereby he was going to work with the gangsters. That's right. He was going to work with the gangsters to supply someone with the arms, with these arms from America. See, all of that's murky. I don't, those details, I have to hash out those details, because those arms were eventually going to make it to Cuba, and then they were going to be, I think they were going to be used by the revolutionaries. But why would the mob supply the revolutionaries to basically overthrow them? Because that's what it was becoming. It was the revolutionaries, and then maybe it was the anti-revolutionaries. They were going to supply the Cuban military. But Wasn't the U.S. supplying the Cuban military? Okay, okay. So I guess what I'm confused about, and what I was thinking about is this: those arms that this white boy from Ohio was going to bring into the United States, they were going to be used by the Cuban army. It had to have been against the revolutionaries, and it was the mob that I guess was footing the bill for it. But what was actually happening? So the story goes, the mob was supplying the weapons for the Cuban army, but I think the story is that the U.S., the CIA, was supplying the arms. The U.S., the CIA was supplying the arms in Cuba. But wait a minute. But those arms weren't going to go to the army. They were going to go to the revolutionaries. Right. Okay, this is my idea. So the United States CIA knew that the arms that were coming from America and going to the Cuban revolutionaries, they used the mob as a scapegoat to say that the mob procured these arms, or rather that the arms were coming from the mob. That was the excuse. I think that's the idea that I had. And basically, what wasn't it the Rothschilds who were playing both sides of what, the Second World War, or some war? I think it was World War One and Two and all. But the Rothschilds, they were playing both sides, so it didn't matter who would win. They were funding, they were arming both sides of the war, of the armies. It didn't matter to them who won, because death and destruction meant profit for them, for the Rothschilds. So basically what I'm saying is the United States was acting like the Rothschilds and supplying both sides, but they were using this excuse that, hey, it's the mob. It's the mob that's doing this. When in fact, the biggest mob of them all is the United States. So I thought about that, because the reason why I arrived at that conclusion is because we have the crack epidemic of the 80s during the Reagan administration. You had these politicians who knowingly traffic drugs into our communities. So as a black American, as an American black man who lived through that time, I know that, diabolical means are afoot. These things are happening, and that people are willing to throw another group or another family under the bus, so to speak, as it were. And when you see, the devastation that was caused in our communities, you don't realize that we were collateral damage in a larger, in the larger, grand scheme of things. Because look at, the United States was funding the Contra. So there were the Sandinistas, who were the communists, and then you had the Contras, who were right wing, and they were backed by the U.S., and they were against them. So the U.S. supported the Contras to suppress the communist, the spread of communism. And how did they do that? They allow crack cocaine, or they allow cocaine into the United States, and then it was converted in order to turn a profit. The drug dealers converted the cocaine into crack. Profits were made. I guess profits were made all around, because the cocaine that came in, there had to have been payments along the way, and whatever payments were received by the U.S. government, those were sent to, or rather, those were transferred. Those were exchanged for the weapons that were eventually sent to the Contras to support them. Meanwhile, the drugs were in the communities and ravaging the communities. And again, we were collateral damage. So at that time, the families that were involved were the North family, the Reagans, probably the Bush, certainly the Clintons, because Clinton, even though he wasn't president yet, wasn't he working in Arkansas? And that's where Barry Seal was landing his planes. So he at least knew of what was happening and allowed it to happen as the governor of Arkansas. So the CIA, people know. These people in these families know what's happening. They know what is happening. And they're allowing it to happen. And so in Cuba, my argument is, my ideal is that the Cuban Revolution was orchestrated by the CIA. Like, now, why then did the CIA orchestrate it? Maybe because the situation in Cuba was becoming untenable for the average citizen, and that it was a revolution was brewing. The circumstances were just horrible, atrocious, and what that means is, at that time you had the casinos operating, and then you had the prostitution, and then you had the Cuban people living in squalor. So when the wealth gap grew so much that the average citizen had no hope of changing their life, changing their conditions, had to live in these poor communities and watch as these rich people just, made off with wealth. The wealth gap, the disparity between the rich and poor was so great, and it was sustained because the rich were getting richer and the poor were just staying there or getting poorer. That being the case, a revolution was brewing, and people were talking, and people were saying we need to make some changes. Now, the one thing that I learned while watching that documentary about that white boy from Toledo is that there were different factions that were planning to overthrow the government in Cuba. So Fidel Castro's faction, his group, well, they weren't alone. It wasn't like Fidel and he jumped on the boat called the Grandma and had 82. There were 82 men with him, or 82 men and women, soldiers, that were going to spark the revolution. It wasn't these 82 people who were going to change Cuba. No, that was just one group, one faction. But there were other factions in other parts of Cuba who had the same ideals, who were led by the same ideals and they were motivated by the same desire to change the country, that change, or rather a revolution, was inevitable. And the 1960s was just that time, that sweet spot where things were going to happen all over the world. The 1960s were just that time. Things were bubbling over, percolating, and then it was time for things to happen. It was just the 60s, just that time. And but the story that you hear often is about Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. They were the only ones, but no, they weren't the only ones. And so All of these things are taking place, but the another ideal that I was thinking about is it's the wealth gap. It's the disparity between the rich and the poor that is going to, or rather, that is the most untenable of circumstances that will lead to the greatest change. When people don't see, you know, when people are dissatisfied, when dissatisfaction is at an all-time high in society, that's when there's a potential for change, potential for revolution, potential for riots, potential for looting, etc. And I would argue that that's what we're seeing right now in American society. Like, especially in the fifth largest economy in the world, California, the state of California. Turn on the news and you'll hear stories about stores being looted. Essentially, they're being looted, but they're not being looted in mass the way that it occurred during the Los Angeles riots of 1992, where every store was looted at once over, I think a 7-day period or so, 4-day period. I'm not sure. No, it's like one store is being hit. They'll have like 20 people run in and start grabbing things, and then they basically walk or run out, but no one is chasing them. There are no security guards fighting or trying to protect trying to stop the loss, right? They're basically like, we're not gonna do anything. We're not gonna harm ourselves trying to protect these goods. It's just gonna be a loss on paper. But the people are doing this because of the disparities in society. And then California, Los Angeles. Well, California has a huge homelessness problem, and these conditions are right. The conditions are in place for a revolution. And what's scary is with the presidential election coming up in November, with there already having been an assassination attempt on President Trump, former President Trump, and then people are warning of, if he doesn't, get into office, that there will be even more. I read today somewhere that there will be a race riot if Trump isn't elected. People are up in arms and willing to do some really crazy things. Possibly in other states, which is a very sad and very terrible, reality. But California is not going to see that type of activity. California is on some other ish. California is on the development and the growth of the Latino, community. But that's another story. But the idea here, though, that I want to drive home is that America may be that the situation in Los Angeles and in California is so untenable that something is going to happen, the same way that it happened in Cuba when the conditions were so untenable that the people, decided that they were going to revolt, and that the people were going to, that the people were ready for regime change. Now, mind you, there are already people who are in position thinking about all of this, making plans, and already have an ideal for what is going to happen. Planning. They called it the plandemic. Sure. What is happening? Yeah. These things are planned. I was watching all these videos on YouTube, and they had the gentleman talking about how the U.S. Okay, the name of the video is something about the man who conned the CIA. The Cuban man who conned the CIA. And basically, he tells the story about how the CIA had a plan for him to ascend to power during a turbulent time in Cuban society. And he talked about how it was a plan. They had a 10, 15-year plan to introduce a new regime. Sure, they tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, and it didn't work. 632 times or whatever is something that I've heard quoted. I've also heard like thousands of times they attempted to assassinate him, and they were unsuccessful. But this guy said that he was going to ascend to power. He was going to be what is it? Inconspicuous. He wasn't already on the political political horizon. He was a university professor, and because he was a university professor, no one would suspect that he was actually backed by the U.S. and that his ideals were, and that he was a puppet. He was a figurehead for the United States. And so, that being the case, he was going to be successful. The U.S. was going to back him, and however, the thing about it is he conned the U.S. or he double crossed the U.S. and he wasn't he was an operative for Cuba. So he was actually spying. He was relaying all of this information to the Cuban government that the U.S. was telling him to do, or preparing him for his leadership role. He was like, "No, I'm Cuban to the core." So he was able to expose the plans that the U.S. CIA had, for him, and he made the comment that when he saw the coup d'etats, the change of the regime change occurring in other countries, and he saw that other university professors were coming to the helm, of the government to orchestrate, or rather to lead the people. He said that everything that he heard from these new leaders was essentially taken from the same script that the US CIA had given him for his ascension to power. So basically, it's been said before by others. I'm saying it now. The US CIA, the US government, the US military, the CIA is wild, and I guess wildly powerful, because all of the coup d'etats, all of these economic activities that are taking place around the globe, the U.S. has a hand in it, is orchestrating it. It's the same thing that, what is it? The economic hitman, is it? The U.S. hitman, what he talked about in his role. Like the guy just explicitly tells the public what's going on. As an economic hitman, he was sent into countries to talk to the government and tell them these are the rules. This is the game plan. You either, you know, lay down or get down. By lay down, you either die or you get down with the program and you follow what we tell you to do. This is this is what the economic hitman was doing in each country, and you see it time and time again. It was just rinse and repeat over and over again. And any politician who did not, get down with the program had to lay down. From Patrice Lumumba in the Congo to Gaddafi in Libya to um, I don't think he was killed, but he was certainly pushed out of power. Jacobo Arbenz or Jacob Arbenz in Guatemala, pushed out of power. Um, yeah, so the U.S. CIA is all powerful. It's capitalism. It's communism. It's the war of families. It's the war of families. And what's going to happen in November? Well, people want Trump in office. People want Trump in office because people are hurting bad. People want economic gains. And what's the saddest part about Trump's presidency is that people are willing to overlook all of his shortcomings, or rather, not even his shortcomings, but all of his, oh, I don't want to say misgivings, maybe misgivings, all the shit that this man has done. Or rather, they want to overlook his lack of character, right? All the money that his family, accumulated, and then his father passed on to him, didn't develop his character. It only made him a rich man who, maintained his position. But yeah, so Trump is a felon, womanizer, and isn't that enough? A felon, womanizer, and yeah, and those are the characteristics that people are willing to overlook just for a buck, just to get some money in our society. So the moral degradation of our society, we're willing to accept a felon, a womanizer, and just say, hey man, just put some money in my pocket and we're good. That's the epitome. That's the definition of moral degradation of our society when we look the other way and accept a bribe. And when we're talking like on a scale that's unheard of, everybody is just like, hey, just give me some money, man. You know. And if they don't get their way, they're gonna turn into little kids and they're gonna stomp their feet and then threaten a revolt and all of these things when he's not the man for the he's not the right man for the job. He's not who we need. Um, yeah. So the economic aspect, the economic benefit, that's what people are talking about, and that's what they want, from Trump, and that's sad. But then the circumstances, has have become untenable in the United States. It's just 40,000 homeless people in Los Angeles or in California. Like, wow. Um, things are a mess, and you can't look at your individual life and say, "Oh, I'm not doing bad, so things are pretty good." Nah, you can't just sit at home and watch the news, sit at home and watch television and say, "Oh, is that what's happening over there? Well, it's not happening here. I'm good." Nah, you can't do that because that's not looking at reality because the media is limiting your view. The view that you can get, the best view that you can get is outside on a daily basis. Going outside and seeing your community, observing who's active in the community, who's working, who's not working. You see the men and women on the streets and you can see it. You can see it clearly. That's the reality. It's not what's on television because television and the media are presenting a skewed view of reality. But if that's where you spend your time staring at the screen, what did Kendrick Lamar say? Can't live your life on the computer. Whether it's the computer, whether it's the television, whether it's your cell phone, you can't just stare at that. You've got to look at the bigger picture. Got to zoom out and see more because then that's the reality. But I know people are stuck on their phones. Or they're stuck on their televisions. They're stuck on their computers because they would rather not deal with the reality right in front of them. They'd rather escape into some alternate space, into another conversation. But the reality is like, bro, it's right in front of us. And as a black man in Los Angeles, I mean, I'm inundated. I am, what is it? Uh, Socrates Fort Low. Always outnumbered, always outgunned. As a black man in Los Angeles, I feel that way. Socrates Fort Low from Always Outnumbered, Always Outgunned, Walter Mosley's book. That's how it is. Some BS. I'm speaking with regard to the Latino, overthrow, takeover. You have intersection takeovers at the intersections. Well, you have takeovers, by the Latinos because Spanish is the unofficial, second language in California, in Los Angeles. And the thing about it is, for us to enjoy our lives in our communities, in our society, we should not feel pressured to leave any establishment, after we've transacted, after we've made a transaction with them. As soon as you pay for some food, you shouldn't have 15 minutes to eat it and then get out of there. Man, you should be able to enjoy yourself, sit down and stay as long as you want. But if you notice, that's not what we do in our societies. We grab our food and then we go. And maybe the only place where we can spend for hours is in a hotel, excuse me, not a hotel, but a home or an apartment that we pay for. Everything is transactional in our society, in this capitalist society. And it's to our detriment because we don't have places where we can just sit and chill. Because basically that's what life is about. It's about chilling. Look at the animal kingdom. What do the gorillas do? But sit around eating most of the day, and then what? Eating and grooming. You know, eating and grooming. That's what their lives are you know consumed with those activities. But a human's life is consumed with staring at a screen, staring at a screen. That's not even real. It's your immediate reality. It's the immediate community that is truly the reality. And if you're connected with the community, then you're better than not. Those are just my thoughts. Capitalism, communism, socialism, Marxism, the CIA, the United States, the mob, um, conspiracies, or rather just families, and what they do in order to profit in our society. All right, the music's off. I'm about to go. Kobe, let them know.
You're at 109 right now.